My name is Shareah Taleghani. I'm a visiting professor in the CMAL department here at Queen's College. My sort of area of research or focus is modern Arabic literature, and I wrote my dissertation about Syrian prison literature and human rights discourse and the relationship between Syrian and Arabic prison literature and literary experimentalism and human rights. So today I'm just going to talk a little, very informally, about my experience with translation. I'm very much an amateur translator. I've taken very little coursework in translation, and the theories of translations I've kind of read on my own after I started translating. So I came to translation as a student of Arabic. It was sort of a means to get to know the language better. And I really didn't start translating until it was around the time of the US invasion of Iraq, and there was a group of us at NYU and Columbia and the CUNY Grad Center who decided to put on a poetry reading of Iraqi poetry in translation. So some of us picked poems and translated them. And it was kind of through that experience that I came to like translation, particularly translating poetry. I tend to like translating poetry better than prose. I'm not sure why. Maybe because it's the idea of finding the exact way to translate a given line or a given image in poetry. So then I had taken a class on prison literature at NYU, and a group of us, all of us grad students, with Ilyas Khouri and Amir Al-Khaleh, who's in the department also, decided to translate a collection of prison poetry by the Syrian poet Faraj Beraktar. And it was a large group of us, so all of us selected poems and translated it, and then Amir and I edited the collection together, right? So it was kind of through that class and through the process of translating that collection, that I started thinking about the idea of prison literature, what prison literature is, what it isn't, that kind of thing. And then I ended up going to Damascus for over a year. I was supposed to be writing about nostalgia. That's what I went to Damascus to write about. I was supposed to be writing about images of the old city of Damascus and nostalgia. And once I got there and started reading about images of Damascus and nostalgia, I really wasn't that engaged with what I was reading. So I felt like I was reading the same description of the same courtyard in the same house over and over and over again, which is beautiful, but a little repetitive. So I had met a couple of people who had been in prison formally, or who knew people who were in prison for political reasons. And so I sort of basically switched topics because of the people I met and the texts I started reading. The prison literature as a genre, of course, is in every world literature, right? There's an extensive body of American prison literature. The difference in the Arab or Syrian context is most of it is written by political prisoners, not people in prison for quote-unquote criminal reasons. So it's a huge genre in Arabic literature, but it's definitely politicized very specifically. It's a body of work generally written by political dissidents, and a lot of it has not been translated. A few works here and there from Iraq and from Egypt, a couple from Morocco, but actually most Syrian prison literature is not available in English. What else was I going to say? What I ran into in translating the literature is the whole issue of politics, actually. Working to being asked, number one, to translate works by authors who had not been able to publish them in Arabic. And that, in essence, kind of, I had a lot of sort of debates about that. Do you translate something into English so that it might get picked up and published in Arabic? Because the author hasn't been able to publish it officially, right? So that's one of the issues I dealt with. And also, I was in Damascus in 2003, 2004, and then again 2005. And this was at the same period of time where momentarily it became technically illegal to edit or translate works from certain countries, including Syria, right? There was a period of time...
Illegal here in the United States?
Yes, yeah. There was a short period where, due to regulations under the Bush administration, the Office of Foreign Assets Control basically said that it was illegal to translate or edit works from particular countries, right? So at the time I was working on a translation for Words Without Borders. It wasn't prison literature, but it was a Syrian author. And the editor called me and said, hold on a minute, because something's going on and we temporarily can't publish it and we have to find out what happens. So there's a whole issue of censorship in Syria, right? Because political dissidents are writing about their experiences in prison, but there's also an issue of censoring certain texts in English at that time. The ban was lifted, otherwise, right, we wouldn't have been able to publish or circulate anything. But the whole idea that an American graduate student would be doing something illegal by translating a text by a Syrian political dissident is very, very problematic, right? Especially, this is like 2003 to 2005. So the other issue that I'm sure O'Neill has talked about is that the process whereby these works are produced, many of them are actually written or composed in prison. And then if the authors are still in prison, they're smuggled out and sometimes then get published, right? A lot of times there are problems with the way they're published because the author is not actually engaged in the final process of publication. So, for example, the edition of poetry by Farej Beraktar that we translated as a group, the published edition, it had been put together by friends of his who had helped to smuggle the poems out of prison, either by memorizing them or they were written on cigarette paper or any form of paper prisoners could find. Then a friend or a couple of friends edited the volume and published it. But because the poet himself wasn't involved, it wasn't under the title he wanted, and there were actually a lot of mistakes in the poems. So when we finally actually had contact with him and we were working with him directly, and I actually got to sit down with him, he showed me what the final version should be, and many of the poems, the meaning actually changed because they were not
transcribed correctly.
They weren't transcribed correctly. So that's another issue of how the works of literature kind of get transferred from prison to the outside and then get published, especially if the authors are not involved in the final steps of publication.
And when you say you sat down with him, meaning he got out of prison?
He had been out of prison, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so we actually sat down and he had a different version of the manuscript with a different title, actually. So it just goes to show how important it is, the relationship of the translator actually sitting down with the author. Because otherwise, I have the version that we originally translated, and some of the poems, the meanings of the lines are completely different, right? Because it's a language where a dot makes a difference.
Yeah.
So that was one of the issues. And also another novel that I had been working on called Asharnaqa, which is The Cocoon, which is by Siba Abdurrahman. I had been working on it several years ago, and I'm coming back to it now. Her novel is based on journals she kept in prison, but when she actually published it, she was out of prison, but no one in Damascus would publish it. So she ended up publishing it in Beirut, but without a publisher's name on it. And when she published it, it wasn't edited at all. So as a translator, when you're reading an unedited publication, and this includes punctuation that is sometimes difficult to figure out, it makes it more tricky, more challenging. Yeah, more challenging. And the other issue I kind of encountered was the fact that I didn't realize, being a very amateur translator, is that oftentimes the translator gets put in the role of speaking for the writer or representing the writer, which in some cases can be very difficult, especially if communication is difficult, with communicating with the author is difficult, or if publishers don't really understand the political perspectives from which certain writers are coming from, right? And in the case of a lot of Syrian dissidents coming from the left, many of them are very much human rights advocates and democracy advocates, but not necessarily pro-American foreign policy, right? You can be pro-democracy but not pro-American. So sometimes I found myself trying to explain the position of writers and editors not understanding where they were coming from. Like, why would a Syrian author not want to be included in an anthology entitled Literature from the Axis of Evil? Why would a Syrian writer find that offensive, right? I actually had a discussion about this, and the editor commented that obviously the writer didn't understand the postmodern irony, and I was like, he doesn't find it ironic for good reason. And so there's a lot of that kind of sort of translating that takes place between the publisher and the translator and the author. So these are basically some of the issues I came across. I'm working on, I really hope to actually put together an anthology of different works of Syrian prison literature, and I'm hoping to get started on that and see that out soon.
How far back do you go, like, with the prison literature? Is it all contemporary?
Most of it is from the 80s and 90s,
okay,
and up until now. Yeah, but there's earlier works like from the 50s. You can go all the way back to the 40s and 30s too, like the nationalists imprisoned under the Mandate.
Right.
Yeah. So, but there was a sort of large amount of stuff that was published in the late 90s up until now, and some of it published by the state actually, which is kind of interesting. There's a series of works that the state permitted and the Ministry of Culture published as a kind of form of state-sanctioned criticism, which surprised me when I was first there, to be at like a festival put on by the Ministry of Culture, and you see a collection of poetry by someone who is a political dissident published by the state. Right?
Wow.
So
did they edit it heavily, or did they censor it, or did they just publish it straight up?
According to this one particular book, it was published as it was. Right? And
wow,
it depends on the particular moment in time, how the regime is feeling about criticism, that things are allowed to be published, or arbitrarily the relationship between the writer and whoever is in charge of censoring.
At that moment.
At that moment, yeah. So
it's a strange message to send.
Yeah, but it's very, I think it's very much part of the system. There's been a lot of sort of commentary on that by Lisa Wadeen, who's a political scientist who had worked on Syria, and Miriam Cook, and also Krista Salamandra, who's at Lehman College actually, about state-sanctioned criticism and how far it can go. Like, what are its limitations, but also what are its consequences, right? Because the state allows some of it to circulate, or it publishes it and then the works aren't allowed to be distributed.
Yeah.
So, but especially with digital publication, now it's being circumvented entirely. And even when I was there in 2005, people were like, do you have a flash drive?
Mm-hmm.
I can give you my 3 novels that I wrote while in prison, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Jeez.
So that's basically been my experience. Like I said, I I'm an amateur translator. So I started reading translation theory actually several years after I started translating. I tend to lean more towards a kind of foreignizing translation pattern, which with Arabic literature, given some of the recent commentaries that have come out, and just anecdotal evidence from friends and colleagues, there's a tendency among major publishers to really want to try to domesticate the translations. And oftentimes the translators lose control over what it actually comes, what the final translation comes out as.
There seems to be like greater ethical stakes for prison literature. I mean, for human rights kind of oriented stuff, of like the voice really matters in a different kind of way.
Yeah.
It seems, you know.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what you were saying before, how publishing something in English for the first time so that maybe they could get it published in Arabic, what exactly you find problematic about that?
Well, I came out of a sort of, the coursework I did in grad school included a lot of discussion about the problems of third world literature being published in English and how particular authors and particular works are privileged, right? Whereas in their own native contexts, they're not, right? So there's it's the idea of the phenomena of writers writing specifically for translation, writing in Arabic, knowing that it's going to be translated in English, and really the larger audience are the people who are going to read Anglophone. Yeah. And so what I found myself troubled by the fact that people were asking me to translate their works into English, with the idea that if it gets translated, then it'll get published in Arabic. And I never found a resolution to that, right? Because it's a question of, if it's not already published in Arabic, there's like a backwards logic to it, right? That you have to get it in English in order to get it published in Arabic,
But in the case of dissidents, you can understand why that might be necessary.
Yeah,
I mean, if it were just a literary writer, it would be a different story.
But for a dissident.
But somebody who it's illegal for him to publish in this country, then there's a rationale for that.
Of course, there's a very good rationale for it. But at the same time, I still found myself troubled by the implications, right? That this text, by publishing it in English, even though it was originally written in Arabic but not officially published, meaning published on paper, right, as opposed to digital publishing, that was it somehow making English the privileged language, right, as opposed to the original language. And that's what I found so troubling. Does the English version become
the official version? The
official version, right? And what do you do about that? And what are the consequences of that for Arabic literature?
Well, think of if the prisoner, for example, were to go into exile, he can't publish in his own country, right? Let's say he gets out of prison. Let's say he gets out of prison temporarily. Let's say he runs away and he comes to America. What's he going to do then? He's going to publish in English because this is where he is.
But it's also a question of audience. Then who is it being written for? That's
what gets me. I could see that when it's.
No, I'm not criticizing you.
No. I'm trying
to understand. You know.
Because it's a very.
Prisoner. I'm thinking of myself. You know. Okay, I'm in prison.
Right.
I would like to. My experiences to share my experiences with other people
outside of prison.
What do I do? Well, I mean, what are my options?
Yeah, the options are limited.
I mean, either be silent, nobody's going to ever read it. except for my wife to whom I smuggle it, or my husband, on the toilet paper during visiting hours. Right?
But I think also that this question was coming up at a time when digital publication had started. Everybody was starting to publish online. Right?
Words Without Borders, right?
Words Without Borders, but actually also, there were, in 2005, there were a lot of people who were on particular, there were sort of political forums in Arabic, writing essays, and also publishing shorter works of prison literature, not entire novels, although some of the Syrian human rights organizations, if you go on there, you find PDFs of memoirs and poetry collections and such. So yeah, it's still, the question of audience is, I think, what troubled me, especially during the particular time that I had started doing the research in, where it didn't, when I was in Damascus in 2003, 2004, people were discussing whether or not the US was going to invade, right? So to publish something by a political dissident in English who might not necessarily want the US to invade is sort of troubling, right? But you still want to publish it because it deserves to be read, right? And
absolutely.
So, there's some ethical issues involved with it.
Are you in contact with people in Syria?
I haven't. I've been very careful about contacting people right now because email is monitored.
Right.
So, and actually contact by can actually cause issues for them. So I wait until they contact me.
Right.
Yeah.
Because communication is under surveillance, right, and can be misconstrued very easily.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
But I'd like to see, there's a whole series of works that are a really important part of Syrian literature as a whole.
Right.
Who's, writers like the short story writer Ibrahim Soumail, who is not published in English except for a couple stories on Words Without Borders. He's a really important short story writer, right, in Syria. If you go into a bookstore in Damascus and you say, what should I read? People will be like, read his work.
Yeah.
And a lot of his earlier stories relate to prison and political dissidents. So I'd love to see like a collection of his works come out, because so little Syrian literature is translated.
Can I just ask, it's a question about genre. When we talk about prison literature here, are we talking about literature, it's not just literature that's written in prison, it's also about prison?
Yeah.
Does it have to be about prison if it's written in prison?
That's a great question, because the actual definition of the genre is completely debated, right?
Yeah.
When I write about it academically, I define it as any text written in, about, or through the experience of political detention. But different authors who I spoke to, or from reading interviews with them, there are completely different definitions, right? One author I spoke to argued that you have to have been in prison to write prison literature, otherwise it's not authentic, right? So anybody writing about prison who hasn't actually experienced detention, it's not part of prison literature. Another author argued that works written in prison that don't depict prison life are not prison literature, right? So
you can't write about
actually,
recollect childhood, or
and there's also
about the Great Wall.
There's also, I think, a concern on the part of writers and poets that if you categorize their work as prison literature, you compartmentalize it, and it's not part of general literature, like it's not considered art. It might not be considered art.
It's kind of in prison in its own
it's in its own prison. And I think for some poets and authors, it's very important that their work be considered part of a more general literature, right? That it's not just prison literature, right? And then there's people who completely, prison literature is memoirs and that's it, right? I'm like, what about the poetry? What about the plays? What about the novels? So
Could you talk a little about the poetry? Because I mean, you were drawn to that.
yeah,
Like, what's it like?
Yeah.
there's many different kinds of poetry that has been produced out of prison, right? And there's a lot of elegiac poetry. A lot of it is not necessarily as political as you might think it would be, right? And some of it is very nostalgic. The author that I worked on with the group, Farish Bayraktar, he's an interesting case because he was a poet before he was in prison, right? And then he stopped when he got involved in politics. In an interview, and also when I talked to him, he said that he stopped writing because he was so busy with his political activism. He stopped composing poetry. And it was only after he was in prison that he started composing again.
That he had time to write poetry.
He had time to compose poetry. Yeah.
There you go.
Time on my hands.
They say prison is like a university, right?
The silver lining.
The silver lining.
Finally.
I actually just read a memoir by, I was reading a memoir that just came out by Yasin al-Haj Saleh, and he talks about nostalgia, the longing for that time when he had all that time to read and educate himself, and
But I mean, it's interesting because I would want to ask about how poetry and activism might actually go together, as opposed to being, well, once I had time forced away from activism, I got back to poetry.
Oh, but there is very poetry that
Yes.
directly reflects political engagement and political opposition.
Sure.
And actually, there's a lot of new poetry coming out of the revolution.
Sure.
I mean, but
Yeah.
the prison poetry is,
The prison poetry, you can see it in some of that. Sometimes it's a little more subtle. Bayraktar is interesting in that he uses a lot of imagery and vocabulary. Some of it's very difficult vocabulary from classical Arabic poetry, including pre-Islamic poetry.
Wow.
So when you read the language of his poems, it's really engaged in a classical poetic tradition, right? And you see it not in the imagery, but not just in the imagery, but like the vocabulary choice. And sometimes the vocabulary is difficult. And the question becomes, how do you render that into English without making it sound like Shakespeare?
Yeah, it has to sound elevated.
Yeah.
Not like,
Yeah, so
Not
there's a
apparently.
bit of a give and take with it when you are transforming it into
It's pretty
English.
cool.
I'm just curious, can you share with us one pre-Islamic image?
There's a series of poets referred to as the brigand poets. They're the Sa'li poets. They were the ones expelled from their tribe, and they're like the rebel poets.
Oh.
So oftentimes they're depicted as sort of being alone, right? Alone with images of sort of courageous animals like the wolf,
Interesting.
right? And so that imagery comes up in his poetry and in others actually. Actually, there was in other works. I remember I was reading the opening lines to a novel, which is not about political prison, but the protagonist is a woman who ends up getting imprisoned. So, but written by a male author. And the first line is straight out of a very well-known pre-Islamic poem. The first line of the novel, and I read it. I was like, "Oh, this is Umar al-Qais." And he was like, "Yes." Like, okay. So there's this engagement, especially with the classical poetic tradition, even in prose. And there is a lot of sort of protest poetry. It's been interesting watching the stuff that gets posted on YouTube
Yeah.
from the ongoing demonstrations and protests. Because poetry, it's in comparison to the U.S., it's much more prominent. It still has a sort of prominent status even among a younger generation, right? So,
Well, help me join in thanking